FC Barcelona footballer Ronald Araujo was taken to the hospital after this concerning head clash earlier today. Welcome back, everybody. I'm Dr. Brian Sutterer, and in this video, we're going to walk through the concerning scenes we saw earlier today in FC Barcelona's game. Here on this play, we can see Araujo go in here for this header, and it's just a completely incidental head clash here where some contact is made, specifically on sort of the left frontal area of his face. This is kind of just above his eye, so potentially involving not only the bones of the skull, but potentially the bones of the orbit. What was really unique about the situation was he actually got up, and we can see him here continuing to run. And so he had this very delayed reaction before ultimately it looks like he even lost consciousness and collapsed down to the pitch. First thing here, when his teammates get over to him, it's important to know not to do this. You don't want to roll them over and reach in, and it looks like they're trying to almost pull his tongue out of his mouth. There's kind of this fear, specifically among footballers, that you need to basically pull the tongue out because you can choke or swallow on your tongue. And really, that's just not true. What happens more so in this scenario is that we're worried about a possible cervical spine injury. And so you can see here in this position, he's as stable as his spine can get without being on a backboard. But then whenever you go and you roll them, you can see how much his head just sort of flops and his neck kind of flops as they go to try and roll him on his side. Now, I know his teammates in the other team are trying to do what they think is safe, but if you're in the situation, leave the athlete alone unless you see that they're visibly like vomiting to where you need to roll them so they don't aspirate and choke. Leave them there, let the medical team come out and properly stabilize their spine before you just go and roll them beforehand. When the medical team gets out there and sees an athlete who is unconscious and down on the field, you're going to often assume the worst and assume that there's been a cervical spine or an injury to the spinal cord and the neck. You can see that's what they're doing here, getting the backboard off. They are concerned that he could have a neck injury. That really takes precedence over just the concussion in terms of the initial stabilization. And so that's why we ultimately saw them actually put him on this backboard before getting him off the field in the ambulance. So here we can see that the cervical spine has been stabilized, and so presumably he either wasn't conscious enough to go through the proper screening to clear his cervical spine, or he still had an altered level of consciousness where they had to assume the worst, protect his cervical spine, get him to the hospital for further evaluation. The differential at the hospital for these types of injuries really goes in the order of what's going to be the most severe in terms of things that could potentially kill you. While a fracture to something like the orbital bone can certainly be serious, it's not going to be life-threatening. And so the first thing they're going to worry about is a potential brain bleed from that trauma to the skull, which could be associated with a fracture of the skull, similar to what we saw happen with Wolves player Raul Jimenez. When we look at our biodigital anatomy tool here, we can understand the bones that might be involved with this type of a trauma. Of course, the area where Araujo gets impacted sort of kind of right here on that frontal area of the skull. The bones there are going to be the frontal bone, which kind of comprises the forehead. And then this sort of prominence that you feel on the side is going to be the zygomatic bone. On more of the side, when we hear about people kind of getting hit in the temple, this is going to be, you guessed it, the temporal bone, and then deeper, the sphenoid bone. When we get kind of further back above the ear, this is the parietal bone. So any of these bones can be involved with this level of trauma, resulting in a possible skull fracture. The bleeding itself can be from a number of different causes if it happens, one being tearing of the veins that actually go across the outside of the brain, and this can lead to something called a subdural hematoma. If you have injury to the artery that sits behind the bones of the skull, this can cause something called an epidural hematoma. A head CT will be done to look for possible bleeding within the brain. But then you're also going to assess, like I said, for things like an orbital fracture, because even though that might not be as severe as a brain bleed, that can certainly result in significant morbidity and trouble with your vision, and you need to properly treat it. Throughout this whole process, as his level of consciousness improves, they're going to be then evaluating his cervical spine to make sure he doesn't have a neck or a spinal cord injury. And then only when all those bad things are ruled out do we say, okay, this is a concussion, and you treat it appropriately with the appropriate return to play gradual protocol. Looking at the replay alone, it's impossible to judge whether or not this is going to be something more severe like a fracture of the skull or a brain bleed, or just your standard concussion. Even things like what we saw in the field with sort of that delayed response in terms of when it actually occurred to when we saw him collapse don't necessarily correspond with the severity. Now, if you have a prolonged period of loss of consciousness, that does imply a more significant injury, which can lead to more prolonged recovery, but doesn't necessarily mean that you do or do not have something like a fracture. And remember, if you're playing sports with your friends and somebody goes down and they're unconscious and you're worried about a possible neck injury, don't try to just roll them around on your own because you could end up doing more damage than good. That's it for the video, everybody. I hope this was educational to take a look at some of the things we think about with an injury like this on the football field. Let me know as always any questions or comments down below. And until next time, we'll see you later. Bye.